This is the story of the Coughin car. Now, I know you don't know what a Coughin car is. The car that your mother and daddy drive today isn't anything like the Coughin car except that it would run down the road, provided you in the front seat and steering it and putting on the brakes and stepping on the gas. The old Coughin car wasn't like that. You did have a steering wheel, and you had some brakes, and you had a throttle. That's the gas pedal that makes it go fast or slow. But it didn't have any top, except one that was folded up in the back, and when it was going to rain, you had to unfold that top and put it up over the top of the car, and even then you had to stretch some curtains out along the side and buckle them to the top and to the side of the car so the rain wouldn't get in. And your mother and daddy's car today have lights so that you just reach up on the front dashboard and you turn on a switch and the lights come on and they shine way down the road. But the Coughin car wasn't like that. You had to stop the Coughin car, and you had to get out and you had to turn on some arc lights. Now, they were bright enough, but you just had to turn them on while the car was stopped, and you got out and got in front of it and turned them on. So you see, it wasn't like the car your mother and daddy had. And there's another difference. When your mother and daddy get in the front seat, all they have to do now is turn on the ignition switch and step on the starter, and your car goes and it's ready to ride. But that wasn't the way with the Coughin car. My daddy had to turn on a switch that was the ignition, and then he had to go around to the front of the car, and right in the front, in the middle, was a crank. And that crank almost dragged the ground when it was running. But usually it had a little pocket up there by one side that you could slip it up there so it wouldn't drag the ground in the rough places. But when he got ready to start it, he would have to go around to the front, and he'd have to crank and 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 crank. And pretty soon the car would say, so he would run around and hop in the front seat, and he would say, well, here we go. And down the road we'd go, just like the car was coughing. Now, I had some family. I had an older sister named Sally, and she and my brother Jim and me and John Knox and my mother and my daddy made up my family. But you know, when we had the Coughin car, John Knox hadn't been born yet. So when we got in the Coughin car, my mother always sat on the right-hand side of the front seat, and that left the left-hand side of the front seat for my daddy, so he could drive the car. And my sister Sally would always sit in the middle of the back seat, so she could sit between Jim and me. Now, that meant that Jim had to sit on her right side, and I had to sit on her left side. And where was John Knox? Why, he wasn't there, because he hadn't been born yet. But we had a lot of good times riding in the Coughin car late in the afternoon over in Lincoln, when we would just take a ride down the road. So when we would start out, my mother would always get in the front seat on the right-hand side. My sister Sally would always get in the middle of the back seat. My brother Jim would always get on the right-hand side, and I would always get on the left-hand side. And of course John Knox wasn't there because he hadn't been born yet. But my daddy would turn on the ignition switch when we were all in our seats, and he'd say, "Well, is everybody ready?" And we would say, "Yes, sir." So then he would go around to the front and he'd start cranking. And he would crank and 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 crank. Pretty soon the old car would say, so he would run around and hop in the front seat, and he would say, "Well, down the road we go." And there we'd go. And when we'd be going downhill, it'd go. And when we'd go uphill, it would have to pull pretty hard, and so it would go. But it was a lot of fun, and we had a lot of good times in the Coughin car, and I'll tell you some more about it tomorrow night. Now, while we had the Coughin car, every summer we would go to the mountains. Now, today we think about going to Montreat to the mountains. And we have real nice roads going to Montreat to the mountains. But then we didn't have very good roads. They didn't have any asphalt on the top or concrete or anything like that. They were just old dirt roads. And most of the time, they were just wide enough for one car. And when you met another car, hey, that was trouble. You had to stop. And then you had to just find a wide place in the road, and you just had to inch by them. But you know, there was another thing about going to the mountains. We went to Valley Cruces. Now, Valley Cruces was a little town, and it was real little. There weren't many people lived there. But it was on the other side of the mountain from Boone, North Carolina. It was not very far from Blowing Rock, North Carolina. But when we were planning to go to the mountains, my mother would have to start several days beforehand, and she would have to pack a whole lot of suitcases to put all of our clothes in the suitcases so we would have them in the mountains. She had a lot of dresses for Sally, and she had a lot of suits for me and for Jim, and she had my daddy's shirts, and she had all of her clothes to put in those suitcases. And you know, I didn't tell you about this when I was first telling you about the Coughin car, but the Coughin car didn't have a trunk. No. My daddy had to get a rack, and he had to strap it onto the side of the car so that it sat on the running board. And he had a rack that he fitted on the running board on the left-hand side of the car. You know, when the rack was on there, we had to use the right-hand side of the car to get in and out of. And when the rack was on there, we couldn't get out of the left-hand side. So that was big enough for about 2 big suitcases. So my mother had to pack 2 big suitcases, and anything else that we were going to take, she had to put in the car, and we might have to sit on top of it, or we might have to hold it on our lap while we were going up the mountains. So then, on the day that we were going up to the mountains, she would have to get up real early, and she would pack a lunch for us to take in some boxes with some paper napkins and all that sort of thing. And we would stop along the road, and we'd have a picnic. Picnic's a lot of fun if it's pretty and the sun's shining, and you have some water to drink. But picnics are not very much fun if it's raining, are they? So when we would be going to the mountains, my mother would have all the suitcases packed, and while she was fixing breakfast, my daddy would get up and he would tie the suitcases onto the rack on the running board on the left-hand side of the Coughin car. And then my mother would have breakfast, and she would be fixing our lunch, a whole lot of sandwiches, and we would all sit down and have breakfast. We'd have to get up pretty early that morning because it took a long time to drive up to Montreat. No, there I go, up to Valley Crucis on those dirt roads. It took all day almost. We would leave right after breakfast, and we'd get up there just in time for supper. And that meant we had to have a picnic lunch along the way. So my mother, and most of my children called her Nana, had to fix that lunch and pack it in the boxes in the car so we could stop and have a picnic lunch. So when we were ready, after breakfast, and all the dishes had been washed, we all went out and got in the car. My mother got in the front seat on the right-hand side. My sister Sally got in the back seat in the middle. My brother Jim got on the other side of the back seat on my sister Sally's right, and I got on my sister Sally's left side. And where was John Knox? Why, he wasn't there because he hadn't been born yet. And so then my daddy would turn on the ignition, and he would say, "Is everybody ready?" And he would go around to the front, and he'd start cranking, and he would crank and 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 crank, and pretty soon the car would say, "Ah, ah, 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 ah." So he would run around and jump in the front seat and say, "Here we go down the road." And down the road we'd go. And when we came to a hill, we'd go. And when we got to the top, we sure were happy. And I'll tell you some more about this tomorrow night. And in the meantime, I'm going to sing you a little song to go to sleep by. Go tell Aunt Patsy, go tell Aunt Patsy, go tell Aunt Patsy, the old gray goose is dead. The one she's been saving, the one she's been saving, the one she's been saving to make a feather bed. Well, one summer we were going to the mountains in the Coughin car up to Valley Crucis. And a terrible thing happened that I'm going to tell you about. You know, I've told you about how we didn't have a trunk on the Coughin car. We had to put suitcases on a rack on the left-hand side. That's the side that the driver sits on. So Nana had gotten all of our clothes, Sally's and Jim's and mine, and hers, and Grandpa's, all cleaned up, and she'd packed them in suitcases, and my daddy, your grandfather, and Robert's great-grandfather, packed them in the rack on the side of the Coughin car. And we got up early one morning, and Nana, my mother, had fixed a picnic lunch. And we started out right after breakfast, after the dishes had been washed and put away. And my mother got in the front seat on the right-hand side, and Sally got in the middle, and Jim got on her right-hand side, and I got on her left-hand side. And, of course, John Knox wasn't there. Why? Because he hadn't been born yet. And my daddy turned on the ignition switch, and he went around to the front of the car, and he cranked, and he cranked, and he cranked, and he cranked and cranked and cranked and cranked. And finally the old car says, and so he ran around and hopped in the front seat and said, well, here we go. And up the road we went. Well, it was a pretty day. The sun was shining. There wasn't a cloud in the sky when we started out. And we went up the road about time for lunch. We stopped right at the foot of the mountain at a little spring where there was a lot of real good fresh water. And we got out the lunch boxes and unpacked our lunch, and we sat down and had a picnic. It was beautiful there. All the pines and the hemlocks and the firs around there, and a lot of good cool water bubbling out of that spring. And we ate lunch, and after lunch we were cleaning up, because you know that's what you have to do after a picnic. You have to clean up all the paper and trash. And we were just about to finish cleaning up when we looked up in the sky, and we couldn't see the sun anymore because there was a great big black cloud up there all over us. And so we ran and got in the car, and we put the top up, and we buckled the curtains to the side of the car and the roof, because we knew it was going to be raining pretty soon. So as soon as we got that done, we hopped in the car. My mother, Nana, hopped in the front seat on the right-hand side. Sally got in the middle of the back seat. Jim got on her right-hand side, and I got on her left. And my daddy went around to the front of the car after he turned on the ignition switch, and he cranked and he cranked, and he cranked and he cranked, and he cranked and cranked, and cranked and cranked, cranked, cranked. Finally the old car says, and he hopped around and hopped in the front seat and says, well, here we go. I hope it doesn't rain too hard on us. Well, up the mountain we went. Old car was pulling pretty hard because the hill was pretty steep. And you know, after a little bit, we came to a place in the road where a stream ran across the road. Now, you know, ordinarily, that stream was so little that we could just splash right through without batting an eye. But when it starts raining in the mountains, the streams get deep real fast because the water runs off and runs downhill so fast. And so this stream was up pretty high when we got to it. But my daddy thought it was all right, and so he went right through after putting the car in low gear so it wouldn't stop in the middle. So he went right across. But you know, that water was so deep. We got across all right, but the water came up and covered the suitcases and leaked down in the clothes and got them all wet. Well, we went on up the mountains in the rain, but then after we got where we were going, to Vallecruces, we discovered that all of our clothes were all wet, and so we couldn't wear any of them till Nana had time to put them out on the clothesline and let them dry and iron every one of them again. Now, that didn't mean much to us, but it sure was bad for her, because it was a lot of work getting all those clothes dried out and real nice so we could wear them again. Well, that's how the clothes got wet. And tomorrow I'll tell you another story of the Coughin car. Good night, and sleep good. Good night.
This is you up here.
But then I didn't think they were supposed to.
So we did want to see him. If we could borrow him, you had a chance to mail him back. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
This is the story of the blowout on the Coughin car. Now, one summer when we were going up to the mountains in the Coughin car, and we had the suitcases on the side of the car in the rack, and we had the lunch in boxes in the back seat, and we had already driven a long way, and it was after lunch. We had already stopped by the spring at the foot of the mountain to have our lunch. And after the picnic and we had cleaned up everything, we had all gotten back into the car. Nana got in the front seat on the right, and Sally got in the middle of the back seat, and Jim got on her right-hand side, and I was on her left-hand side, and it was a pretty day, real pretty. We didn't have to have the top up, and we didn't have to have the curtains on, because there wasn't a cloud in the sky. So my daddy turned on the ignition, and he ran around to the front of the car, and he cranked and he cranked and cranked and cranked and cranked and cranked and cranked and cranked, and pretty soon the old car says, ah, 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 ah. And so he hopped around and got in the left-hand side of the front seat under the steering wheel and said, well, up the mountain we go. So up we went. Now, I've told you that those roads back in those times were just plain old dirt roads, and they were kind of narrow. And we didn't have any asphalt or paved roads like we do today. You know, on the roads today, you can whiz right by another car, but back in those days, if you met a car, you had to find a good wide place in the road and just ease by each other. Sometimes you had to back up to find a wide place where you could pass. Well, we were struggling up the mountain. And the sun was shining, and the weather got pretty hot, and up one stretch, we were going, and then a strange thing happened. We heard something go, pow! And then the old car started going, bump, 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 bump. Well, my daddy knew what happened. We had a flat tire. And that pow we heard was the blowout. When the air just got so hot inside the tire, and it must have struck a rock or something, because the tube inside of the tire just busted out. And so it was flat as it could be on the bottom. Of course, it wasn't flat on the top, was it? Well, so that meant that we had to get out, and my daddy had to fix that tire. You know, in the car that your mother and daddy drive, in the trunk, there's a spare tire, a fifth one. There's 4 on the road and a 5th one in the trunk. So if we get a flat tire today, all we have to do is put that spare on the wheel and go on, and we take the flat tire to the filling station and get it fixed. But, no, we didn't have a spare tire, not on the Coughin car. So my daddy had to get out the jack. You know what a jack is? It's something you put under the car and crank it up, and it lifts the wheel off the road so you can get the tire off. so my daddy got out the jack, and he lifted that back wheel up off the road until he could get the tire off. And so he had a little kit, not a kitten, but a kit with some repair stuff in it. And he got that old tube out and found where the hole was, and he put a patch over that hole in the tube. Then he put the tube back in the tire and put the tire back on the wheel. All right, that was fine. Of course, he let the jack down so that the wheel was on the ground again. But there still wasn't any air in the tire. And there wasn't any filling station anywhere around. So he had to always carry a pump to pump air in the tire. And so he hooked up the pump and he started pumping. And in the hot weather, even though it was up in the mountains, that was a job. And he would have to pump and 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 pump. And finally he got enough air in there to hold it up off the ground, so that the tire had enough pressure in it. And so then Nana got back in the front seat on the right, and Sally got in the back seat in the middle, and Jim got in the back seat on her other side, and I got on her left-hand side. And John Knox wasn't there. No, he hadn't been born yet. And my daddy turned on the ignition, and he went around to the front, and he cranked and he cranked and he cranked and cranked and cranked and cranked. Pretty soon the old car said, ah, 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 ah. And up the mountain we went. Ah, 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 ah. And pretty soon we were at the top, and then we started down the other side toward Veracruz. And we got there, and I sure am glad we didn't have any more blowouts. And we had a great summer. Now, I think that's enough for tonight. So, good night, sleep tight, don't let the buggers bite. Baby's boat's a silver moon, sailing o'er the sky, sailing o'er the sea of sleep, while the clouds roll by. Sail, baby, sail, out across life's sea. Only don't forget to sail back again to me. Baby's fishing for a dream, fishing near and far. His line a silver moonbeam is, his boat a silver star. Sail, baby, sail, out across life's sea. Only don't forget to sail back.
Mr. Duck went to call on Mr. Turkey, and he walked with a wobble, wobble, wobble. Mr. Duck said, how do you do to Mr. Turkey? Mr. Turkey said, gobble, gobble, gobble. Mr. Duck then answered, quack, 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 and turned around to go right back. Mr. Turkey said, I'll go with you. And they looked so very queer, those two. Mr. Duck was walking, wobble, wobble, wobble. Mr. Turkey talking, gobble, gobble, gobble.
Robert, this is Papa. You know, I've got a real good friend named Henry Newsom, and he's been our friend for a long, long time, like ever since your daddy was about 3 years old. You know, really, he's been a friend of ours longer than that. But he had a little girl named Sylvia, and he used to love to tell her bedtime stories. And like about Jack and the Princess, and how they went to find the Kibba-Jibba. And so Henry is going to tell you those bedtime stories. And I just want you to know that he knows who you are, and he wants you to come see him the next time you're in Charlotte. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Henry and let him tell you those stories he used to tell his little Sylvia. And your daddy, Rob.
Hello, Robert. This is Henry Newsom. I live in Charlotte, where Papa lives. And like Papa says, I've known him and Belward a long, long time. And of course, I've known your daddy, Rob, ever since he's been born. And I don't know you yet, but I sure hope you'll come to see me when you come to Charlotte. But like Papa says, I do want to tell you a story about Jack and the Princess and the Kibba-Jibba. Now, the Kibba-Jibba is a strange animal, and you spell it K-I-B-A, J-I-B-A, Kibba-Jibba. And there are not many of them here in this world, so they're very rare. But there's one in the zoo there in Boston, and I want you to ask your daddy Rob to take you to see it, because that's the one that Jack captured in India. And this is the story of how it got to the zoo in Boston. Once upon a time, there was a little boy named Jack, and he lived in Boston, and he had a real good friend named Robert Abernathy, and they played together and had a grand time. Now, Jack's daddy traveled a great deal in his business, and one day he came home from work, and at the supper table he said, "You know, I've got to go to India on business. And the zoo here in Boston has asked me while I'm there to see if I could possibly get a rare animal called a Kibba-Jibba and bring back here for all the people in Boston to see at the zoo." Well, Jack was very excited, and he immediately said, "Oh, Daddy, can't I go to India with you and help you capture a Kibba-Jibba?" Well, Jack's daddy said, "Oh, I don't think so, Jack," and he looked at Jack's mother. But later on, they talked about it, and they told Jack that maybe he could go, and would he like to take a friend. Well, Jack immediately thought of Robert Abernathy, his good friend there in Boston. And Jack's daddy said, "Well, in the morning, you can go over and ask Robert if his mother and daddy will let him go with us to India to look for Kibba-Jibba." Well, of course, Jack couldn't wait until in the morning, and right there and then he hopped up and ran down the block to ask Robert if he could go to India with him. Well, Robert was very excited, and he asked his mother, Rob and Carolyn, if he could go to India with Jack and his daddy to look for Kibba-Jibba. Well, that was a long way for a very little boy to go, but they thought it would be a wonderful trip, and much to Robert's surprise, they said yes, he could go. Well, you can imagine the excitement, and the boys getting ready to go to India. And in several days' time, they had packed all of the things they needed, sleeping bags and frying pans and things because they'd have to camp out in the mountains where the Kibba lived. But they were going to fly in an airplane there, and it wouldn't take them long. And in a very few days, sure enough, there they were at the airport saying goodbye to Robert's mother and daddy and Jack's mother, and off they went in a great big Pan American airplane for India. Well, they had a wonderful trip down, and the weather was fine, and it wasn't long before they had landed in India and were making ready to go up into the high mountains to look for Kibba. But you just can't go off by yourself looking for Kibba, so they had to get a guide to take them into the mountains. Well, it took several days to get all the equipment together, and they had to get horses to ride and a guide to take them. And one day, when they were almost ready to go, Robert and Jack were walking down through the town, and they saw this lovely little girl, just about their age, walking down the street with a lady holding her hand. And she seemed very friendly, and the boys spoke to her. And the lady said, "Are you all Americans? Do you come from Boston in America?" And the boys said, "Yes, we do. How did you know?" And the lady said, "Well, you sounded like Americans to me. And this is Princess Sylvia. And she speaks English. And she lives in a castle right on the outside of town. And since she speaks English and you speak English, she would love to have you come visit her tomorrow." Well, the boys were very excited, and when they got back to the hotel, they told Jack's daddy about it. Well, what do you know, it just so happened that Jack knew the princess's daddy, the Prince of India, and he had done business with him before and bought oil and all kinds of things to ship back to America from him. So he was delighted to have the boys visit Princess Sylvia the next day. Well, the boys couldn't imagine visiting a real princess in a real castle, but the next day there they were. And they had a wonderful time. And the castle was beautiful, and the princess was lovely, and the prince and the prince's wife were just lovely to them, and they all had a grand time. And they promised the princess that if they found a Kibba, they would bring it back by the castle and let her see it, because it was such a rare animal that even the princess had never seen one. So, within a few days, after getting everything together, off they went to the mountains to look for Kibba, all packed up with the things piled high on the horses' backs, the tents, the cots, the frying pans, the food, and the guide led them up a steep mountain trail up into the high mountains of India to look for the Kibba. Well, they spent several nights on the trail, which the boys enjoyed very much, and every night Robert and Jack and his daddy and the guide would gather around the campfire to decide just how they'd go about capturing a Kibba. After several days climbing, they came finally to the very top of the mountain, and sure enough, there the guide found a Kibba trail, which looked just like an ordinary path to Robert and Jack. But to the guide, it looked like a Kibba trail, so he said, "Here's what we have to do. We dig a very deep hole right here in the middle of the trail. But of course the Kibba isn't foolish enough to jump in the hole, so we cover it over with little sticks and grass and leaves so that it looked just like the rest of the ground around it. And when the Kibba comes down the trail and steps on it, kabump, he'll fall through down into the bottom of the hole we've dug, and it'll be so deep he can't get out, and then we'll have him captured." So they set about, and it was hard work digging the deep pit, but finally, before the day was over, they had it done, and they had it all covered over with sticks and leaves and grass, and that night, when they went to bed, they were very excited and hopeful that they would catch a kibba-jibba the next day. They were up bright and early in the morning, and they hid themselves in the bushes on the side of the trail and waited real quietly for the kibba-jibba to come along. After a while, they got very tired of waiting and not speaking, but just as they were about to leave, Robert said, "Listen, Jack, do you hear something funny in the distance?" And Jack listened, and sure enough, way off in the distance, they heard something say, "Kibba-jibba, kibba-jibba, kibba-jibba." And the guide said, "That's it. That's a kibba-jibba. Now everybody squat down behind the bushes and be very quiet and listen real carefully." And sure enough, closer and closer, they heard, "Kibba-jibba, kibba-jibba, kibba-jibba." And as the kibba-jibba came closer, it got louder and louder, and then all of a sudden, kablunk! The kibba-jibba stepped on top of the leaves and the grass and the twigs and fell kaplop right in the bottom of the pit. Well, they all rushed to the edge of the hole and looked down, and sure enough, there in the bottom of the hole, looking up at them, was a great, big, beautiful kibba-jibba. Now, neither one of the boys had ever seen a kibba-jibba before, but it was about the size of a small pony, except much fatter and rounder. It had black, silky fur, and right down its back were two white stripes. The tips of its ears were white, and it had big brown eyes that looked up at 'em out of the hole. Well, then the next problem was to get him out of the hole. But the guide had come prepared for that. So they had a big net and some ropes, and they dropped the net down in the hole over the kibba-jibba and drew it tight around him with the ropes. And then Robert and Jack and Jack's daddy and the guide all pulled, and finally they got the kibba-jibba up out of the hole and into a big box that they had brought to carry him down the mountain in. Well, they were so tired when they got through pulling the kibba-jibba out of the hole that they had to rest. So while they were resting, Robert and Jack decided they would try to make friends with the kibba-jibba, because he didn't seem at all like a wild animal, and he certainly didn't look like he would bite them, and they knew he must be hungry, so they tried to see what he would eat. Well, they offered him hamburger meat, and he didn't like that. And they offered him some bubble gum, and he didn't like that. And they offered him some post toasters that they had brought along for their breakfast, and he just loved it. So they fed him all the post toasters they had, and the kibba-jibba just licked his lips and smacked like he just liked it better than anything in the world. Well, they loaded the kibba-jibba up on their shoulders and started down the mountain with him. And it took several days for them to get him down and put him on the ship to bring him back to Boston. And while they were on the ship, the kibba-jibba and Robert and Jack got so friendly with each other that they could take him out of his cage and tie a rope around his neck and walk him around the ship. And he even got such friends with him that they could ride on his back, and they had a great time. As you might expect, by the time they got back to Boston, they were so fond of the kibba-jibba, and the kibba-jibba loved them so much that they decided they just could not put him in the zoo, that they wanted to keep him and play with him. Well, then the question was, will he stay with Robert at his house, or will he stay with Jack at his house? So they decided that the kibba-jibba could stay with Robert for a week, and then he would come over to Jack's house and stay a week. Well, the boys had a great time with the kibba-jibba, and he played with them like a puppy dog, and they could ride on his back, and they took turns riding him around the neighborhood, and all the children in the neighborhood could ride him, and it was just like having a pony in the family. And they had a grand time, but after a while they realized that the kibba-jibba was a little bit lonely, because after all he couldn't go downtown shopping with them, and he couldn't go to Sunday school or church with them, and he got a little lonesome being left at home by himself when the boys and their family would go away. So it was finally decided that the best place for the kibba-jibba was in the zoo. So that's how the kibba-jibba got to Boston, and while he loved staying with Robert and Jack, the best place for him was at the zoo. And the boys went down real often to visit him, and I know you'll want to do that too. So the very next time you have a chance, you ask your daddy Rob to take you down to the zoo to see the kibba-jibba, because I know he's lonesome and wants to see you. Now, I'll tell you a story again about some more adventures of Jack and the Princess, and Robert goes along with them a lot too. So until the next time, goodbye, Robert. I'll see you. Hello, Robert. This is Henry Newson again. I wanted to tell you one more story about the kibba-jibba. And so here goes. You remember we left the kibba-jibba in the zoo in Boston. But one day, Jack's daddy got a call from the people at the zoo, and they said that the kibba-jibba was getting so lonesome that he couldn't eat his food, and he was getting real thin and bad looking, and they thought the trouble was that he needed another kibba-jibba to play with. Of course, he loved people, and especially little boys like you, but he just missed having another kibba-jibba for a friend. And they asked Jack's daddy if he were going back to India anytime soon, would he try to catch another kibba-jibba and bring him back for the one they had to play with. Well, of course, when Jack heard about this, he immediately told his good friend Robert Abernathy, and they just started begging their parents to let them both go back to India with Jack's father to see if they could catch one more kibba-jibba. And they learned that the best way to catch another kibba-jibba, since they were getting scarcer and scarcer every day, was to take this kibba-jibba with them and let him find one in the mountains for them and help them catch him. So, after much talk and discussion, it was decided that Jack and Robert Abernathy could go back to India with Jack's daddy, and that they would take the kibba-jibba with them to help them find one. Well, you remember they had promised the Princess Sylvia that when they caught a kibba-jibba, they would bring it by and let her see it. And in getting the other kibba-jibba back home, they had been in such a hurry that they forgot all about it. So this was a good chance to let the princess see the kibba-jibba they had caught and taken to Boston with them, and also get to pay the princess a little visit themselves. So, again, after many weeks of getting ready, they took a Pan American airplane and sailed down to India and had a wonderful trip. Now, the princess's father and the Princess Sylvia met the boys and Jack's daddy at the airport in a beautiful royal limousine and drove them right on out to the castle that was on the outside of town. And there they spent several happy days playing with the princess and wading in the wading pool and swimming in the swimming pool and taking trips on the ponies that the princess had all over the grounds of the castle. They had to get another guide to take them up in the mountains because they couldn't get the same one that they had had before. So they got a new guide that the princess' daddy knew, named Coco. And Coco was real kind to the boys and helped them all get ready to start up into the high mountains again to look for another kibba-jibba. Well, the day before they left, the princess started asking her daddy, the prince, if she couldn't go along with the boys. And that was really something new, 'cause they didn't know whether a little girl like the princess could stand all of that travel up into the mountains on horseback riding and camping out at night. But she seemed such a good sport, and she was such a good friend of the boys, that the prince decided that he would let the princess go with them. And there they were, Jack and the princess and Robert Abernathy and the guide Coco and Jack's daddy, all packed up once more, ready to go high up into the mountains to look for the second kibba-jibba. One bright morning, very soon, everything was ready, and they started out up the mountain trail. And the princess proved to the boys that she was just a grand traveler, and she could camp out just like the rest of them and help cook the breakfast over the campfire and scramble eggs in the frying pan and fix the post toasters for breakfast. And they had a grand time, and it took them 2 days to get up to the top of the mountain. Well, sir, the first night that they were up there, they didn't hear anything that sounded at all like a kibba-jibba. So the next morning, they took the kibba-jibba that they had brought with them and put him on a long leash or rope and started down the same kibba-jibba trail where they had captured the first one. But much to their disappointment, the kibba-jibba couldn't find any trace of another one, and he sniffed around the trail and went over to the side of the trail and sniffed around in the bushes, and they walked and walked, but no sign of another kibba-jibba. And pretty soon the princess got tired, and she decided that it was time for them all to take a rest. So they sat down on the side of the road, and the kibba-jibba sat with them, and they petted it and had a grand time there while they were resting. But pretty soon the princess said, "I would like to walk down the trail a little piece and look for some wildflowers." So they said, "Well, don't go far because we'll have to start back to the camp pretty soon." She said, "I'm old and I'll be right back." So she walked down the trail, and everybody got busy talking about catching another kibba-jibba. But pretty soon they realized that they couldn't see the princess, and she had disappeared out from their sight. So they walked down the trail in the direction she had gone, thinking that they would see her any minute. But what do you know? She was gone, and then they really didn't know what to do. But Robert Abernathy had a good idea. He said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take the kibba-jibba off of the leash, and I'll bet you that he can track the princess, 'cause he's just good at that." And so sure enough, they took the kibba-jibba off the leash, and the kibba-jibba started down the trail, sniffing this way and sniffing that way, and they followed right behind him, and pretty soon he turned off on another little trail to the side, and they followed real close, and the kibba-jibba broke into a little trot, and everybody trotted behind him, and they came to this cave on the side of the trail, and the kibba-jibba stopped in front of the cave and sniffed and sniffed, but he wouldn't go in the cave. So Jack and Robert said, "Well, you hold the kibba-jibba here, and we'll go in and see if the princess is in there." Well, sir, Jack's daddy didn't think much of that idea, but the entrance to the cave was so small that none of the others could get in, so they finally agreed to let the boys go in the cave and see if the princess was in there. So there they went, crawling on hands and knees into the cave, and they went way back under the hill in a tunnel, and right at the end of that tunnel they saw daylight. And they came out on the other side of the mountain, and the sun was shining on a beautiful valley, and there were wildflowers there, and there was the princess safe and sound picking beautiful wildflowers just by the armful. And she waved to the boys just like nothing had happened, and they waved back. And Robert said, "I'll stay here with the princess while you go back and get the others." But Jack said, "We can't go back and get the others 'cause the hole's too big. Too little, for them to get through." So they said, "Well, we'll just have the princess come with us." So they took her by the hand and took her back through the tunnel, which it was through the mountain, and they were so delighted to see him, but they said, "You surely did give us a scare, and don't wander off any more like that, because we might not have the kibba-jibba to track you and let us know where you went." So they went back to camp, and that night, again, way off in the distance, they heard a kibba-jibba. You remember what he said? That's right. It said, "Kibba-jibba, kibba-jibba, kibba-jibba." And it sounded like a very small kibba-jibba, 'cause it just went way up high. Kibba-jibba, kibba-jibba. And that next morning, they took their kibba-jibba, and sure enough, he sniffed around on the trail and started loping down the trail. And pretty soon they came on this, what do you reckon, a baby kibba-jibba, just about as big as a little puppy dog. And it had gotten lost from its mother, and it was so glad to see their kibba-jibba that it just came up to it, and the kibba-jibba licked it on the nose, and they took it and put it in a big basket and took it back to camp with them. Well, sir, the big kibba-jibba was so glad to get the little one as a playmate, and he treated it just like it was his own little baby. And it wasn't long before they were back at the castle with their own big kibba-jibba and the baby kibba-jibba that they could take back to Boston. They were sorry to tell the princess goodbye, but they had to get back home to Robert's mother and Jack's mother, and to get the little baby kibba-jibba back in the zoo. And when they got back to Boston, everybody was so glad to see them, and they had the little baby kibba-jibba for the big kibba-jibba to play with, and they were all very happy. So now, at the zoo in Boston, if you go there today, you can see not only the big kibba-jibba that Jack and Robert got, but the baby kibba-jibba as well. And I know you'll want to do that. Well, that's all for this time. And maybe again I can tell you about another adventure of Jack and the Princess, and I'm sure they'll want to take you along with. But before I say goodbye for good, I just want to say that I know that beside the baby kibba-jibba there in Boston, there's a brand new baby at your house too, Robert, named Francis. And I think it's just wonderful that you have not only a baby kibba-jibba there in the Boston Zoo to go see, but a real live baby sister in your home. And I know you are just as pleased as Punch to have her. So give my love to your daddy and your mother and your new sister Frances, and I'll see you again. So long, Robert.